Published almost a decade after the first book, The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice is both a prequel and a sequel to the earlier Interview with the Vampire. The framing device depicts events taking place after the framing scenes of Interview, but the bulk of the story is situated before the primary narrative of said novel. The Vampire Lestat is in conversation with the first book on multiple levels. The inciting incident in the present day is the protagonist learning about the in-universe publication of Interview with the Vampire. And the ending is a cliffhanger leading into the third novel, The Queen of the Damned. So, it would be a difficult book to adapt into a standalone work under the best of circumstances. From premise alone, you'd be forgiven for thinking that maybe Lestat the musical isn't intended to stand on its own. It is possible for a Broadway musical to be a prequel to a successful Hollywood movie. But Lestat isn't a prequel shining a new light on the events of Interview. Where the novel offers justifications for its protagonist's actions in the original story, the musical opts not to include them. But also, the musical is not a prequel in that, while Act 1 adapts The Vampire Lestat, Act 2 adapts Interview with the Vampire. The show takes the events of these books and puts them in a linear order without, I'd argue, thinking through how that transforms the story. In making this video, my options for visuals are limited. Where I can, I've used clips from the bits and pieces of promotional footage that exist, but for the most part I am reliant on bootleg recordings. And these are not your fancy iPhone bootlegs. No, these are videos that were recorded using the portable camera technology of 2006 and then spent years being shared and uploaded and re-uploaded in ways that further degraded their quality. Get ready for some 240p vampires, alright? Alright. I'm pretty sure the first time I heard someone mention Lestat the musical, I thought they were joking. The fact that it's just called Lestat really makes it sound like something that would exist in the Vampire Chronicles universe. I'm imagining, like, Lestat insists on playing himself. He's constantly getting into arguments with everyone behind the scenes. And then, a few days after opening night, the theater critic for the New York Times goes missing. Because, yeah, the show was panned critically. Much of the coverage of Lestat at the time compared it to the two other recent vampire musicals, Dance of the Vampires in 2002 and Dracula the Musical in 2004. Suffice it to say that both were considered failures. This was not a favorable comparison, and Lestat was eager to distance itself. The version of the show's program floating around online goes so far as to insist this is a non-vampire vampire musical, whatever that means. The working title when the show was first announced was The Vampire Lestat, and I assume this is why they changed it. They didn't want to even have vampire in the title. That write-up in the program goes on to say, "The immediate image of singing vampires can induce a veritable wave of hilarity and sarcasm." And maybe I should chalk it up to the ways popular perception of musicals and or vampire fiction has shifted in the intervening years, but I'm kind of baffled by this assumption. Especially if we're talking about Rice's vampires, all of that intense melodramatic emotion seems like it would be a great fit for musical theater as a medium. If there's one character across all of fiction who I would accept bursting into song with zero prior warning, it might be the Vampire Lestat. But no.
It's a very brave subject matter to write a musical about.
On some level, I do understand the desire expressed in behind-the-scenes content to steer clear of the cliches of the vampire genre, but at a certain point it starts to feel like they're embarrassed to be working in that genre at all. And I think that sucks. Pun intended. You made a musical about vampires. Embrace it. A broad overview of the story before we get too much deeper into particulars. The musical starts by introducing us to Lestat. He moves from his hometown in rural France to Paris with his friend Nicholas. When he hears a mysterious voice calling to him in the night, he ventures out to investigate, and the vampire who'd been calling to him attacks and turns him. Lestat's mother, Gabrielle, comes to Paris to tell him that she's dying, but after learning that her son has access to immortal life, insists that he turn her, which he does. Soon after, Armand, the leader of a local coven, makes himself known to the pair, and in the course of a single song, Lestat upends the vampiric social order he'd spent centuries maintaining. Lestat reunites with Nicholas, who demands to be made a vampire as well. He, however, does not take well to the blood. Unresponsive Nicholas in tow, Lestat and Gabrielle set off in search of the fabled ancient vampire Marius in the hopes he could lead them to a cure. Nicholas dies, Gabrielle leaves Lestat to wander the wilderness on her own, and we cut to intermission as Marius does, in fact, appear. In Act 2, Marius tells Lestat he should go live out a new life in America. No, this does not make more sense in context, because the reason he tells him specifically to go to New Orleans has been cut from this adaptation. Regardless, Lestat soon arrives in said city, where he hits it off with Louis. He resents Lestat for making him a vampire. To stop Louis from leaving him, Lestat turns a young girl named Claudia to be their daughter. She too grows to resent him.
Don't blame me, it's your fault that I want more.
Eventually, she tries to kill him. A weakened Lestat returns to Paris to seek help from Armand, who reveals that Louis and Claudia are also in the city at that very moment. After Lestat lets slip that Claudia has violated the highest law of vampire kind in attempting the murder of one of their own, Armand has her executed. And then, well, the ending is one of the places the musical most diverges from its source material, so I think we'll get there when we get there. This show's interpretation of most of the lead characters is more or less what I'd expect. Gabrielle lacks the T-boy swag she has in the book, but that's unsurprising. No, the one real exception is that this take on Armand is, well...
These two do not hide in shadows as we do, but walk among mortals. They have even dared enter the house of God. Take them!
It's giving gay-coded Disney villain. Lestat, the musical, had a brief run in San Francisco from December 2005 to January 2006, began previews on Broadway in March of 2006, officially opened a month later, and closed in late May. The creative team made extensive changes to the show between San Francisco and opening night on Broadway.
And I was rewriting the very last minute until they actually made me stop. I had lines. I was like, and they made me stop.
And I have not been able to find a recording of the finalized version of the musical as it existed after previews ended. There's one bootleg that is often labeled in re-uploads as being from opening night, but from what I've read about the changes Lestat went through, I am positive this recording is not, in fact, from opening night. So, while I have a general sense of what the final staging was like, it's possible that individual lines of dialogue or moments of blocking I'll talk about in this video didn't make it in. Take everything I have to say with that grain of salt. A major part of this production's aesthetic are projections, primarily in the form of artsy short films which play anytime one of the vampires feeds. Production materials refer to these moments as swoons. The design choice emphasizes the strange intimacy of the blood drinking over the spectacle of gushing red liquid. In theory, anyway. It's not exactly something that comes through at all in a bootleg. The paratexts around Lestat are all beautiful time capsules of the early 2000s. Like, the official website has a download of the trailer for your 5th generation iPod. Lestat on the go! Is this a thing people did? Download and rewatch trailers? I guess I should appreciate the privilege of being able to watch the Lestat trailer on my phone anytime I want. Also, for reference, this is what the musical's trailer looked like.
I have loved, I have killed, and now I will finally tell my story.
The fan websites from the time are similarly delightful relics. Like, look at this, look at this, look at this. As I said before, Lestat closed after a relatively short run. And then adding insult to injury, it was announced that the original cast recording would not be released. The fans on these websites rallied. They had a letter-writing campaign. They were planning to make wristbands. Unclear to me if that actually happened. Their campaigning was in vain. Lestat the musical now exists only as scattered bits of video. In general, I feel like the creative team on Lestat successfully identified what the issues were with the initial San Francisco version, but often their solutions created new problems. For instance, apparently a frequent criticism was that the story was difficult to follow for people not already familiar with the books, so they reworked and simplified parts of the plot. In the San Francisco version, the song In Paris is Lestat and Nicholas daydreaming together about moving to the big city. On Broadway, we skip past this part of their lives to get to the action faster, so it's instead an ensemble number establishing Paris as a location once they're there. It brings the energy up after 2 slower-paced opening songs, but now the lyrics are just kind of nothing. When the people singing Paris, she was made for us, are the citizens of Paris, it becomes a tautology. Which is too bad, because overall the reshuffling and condensing of the events of Act 1 works rather well. Instead of Nicholas and Lestat planning their move to Paris together, they run into one another after moving there separately. It puts their relationship in a precarious position from the beginning. They're childhood friends with deep affection for one another, but it's been a while since they've last spent time together. Now, the two never share a duet. Nicholas sings to Lestat, Lestat sings about Nicholas, but they're never united in a moment of emotion, never on the same page in that way. It adapts the spirit of where their relationship goes in the book, while simplifying the sequence of events it takes to get us there.
Out of reach, right before my eyes.
The act of looking is a recurring lyrical motif in Lestat.
Just look at you. Look at you. Look at me. Look at you. Look at you. Just look at me when I say look at you.
This might be the result of a lyricist inexperienced with musical theater wanting to have characters describe themselves or one another and grasping for a more dynamic phrasing than I am, you are. But that doesn't mean it can't also be thematic. Seeing someone, looking at them, as distinct from being present with them. Consider the act of watching a performer on a stage. What you see is not the same as the real person beneath the costume. In a notable departure from the source material, Lestat is one of few characters in the musical who was not a theater artist. When we meet Nicholas in Paris, he's making a living as an actor. Armand eventually becomes a part of the theater of the vampires, and so too do Louis and Claudia. In the one performance we see the latter two in, they play vampire hunters.
Praise God! The vampire is dead!
Before that, though, Lestat, Louis, and Claudia were, maybe, happy. The part of the musical depicting their time together is not devoid of conflict, but it is the sequence that leans most into comedy in framing these conflicts.
You must read this book. The author has given us magical powers. According to him, we can turn ourselves into steam and pass through a keyhole. And look at this. Apparently, we can transform into bats.
Louis thinks he's in a gothic horror novel. Lestat thinks he's in a 1990s family sitcom. That's why he doesn't expect the murder attempt. In making Lestat our point of view character, even where adapting material from Interview with the Vampire, the show remains vague about what Louis' life was like before Lestat's arrival, about what he does with his time when he isn't playing the vampiric house husband. How do Louis and Lestat afford their nice house? Don't worry about it. It's probably fine. I bring this up mostly because I do think the ambiguity means it would be easy for a revival of Lestat to retool things such that it leans on audience knowledge of the AMC show rather than the movie. And the original production does lean on the movie, at least a little. Here, as in the film, Louis has just lost his wife rather than his brother. Although in this case that ends up reinforcing rather than undercutting the presence of queerness in the narrative, because the dialogue draws an explicit parallel to Nikki's death. When Louis and Lestat meet, they are both recently widowed. The theater critic for the San Francisco Chronicle wrote in his review that too much of the first act consists of Lestat actor Hugh Pinero and an attractive Roderick Hill as best friend Nicholas, looking uncomfortable, trying to figure out how homoerotic their friendship is supposed to be. By the time the show made it to New York, they had figured it out, and the answer was very. At some point, Lestat and Nicholas went from sitting side by side on a couch to laying on top of one another in Nikki's bed. There's a lot of that in this show. There is also one gay kiss. Not with either of the men who Lestat is, in a relationship with over the course of the play, but with his homoerotic rival Armand. I probably wouldn't bother noting this distinction between kissing on the mouth and other physical affection if it weren't for the fact that, while much of the overt queerness was added in the move from San Francisco to Broadway, both stagings do include a Lestat-Gabrielle kiss. I guess incest is fine, but we had to draw the line at being gay. Pointing to any one of these moments to say that the musical's queerness is explicit in a way the movie's isn't would feel arbitrary, but taken as a whole, that is nevertheless the feeling I'm left with. There's this one essay I read about the show written by a fan who saw it live 6 times, which I think articulates this well. It was the first adaptation of the Vampire Chronicles that didn't straightwash the characters, but instead kept their queer relationships as integral to the story. I'd argue that Lestat the musical was better queer representation than the Vampire Chronicles novels, where the vampires' queerness is tied up in their indulgence in sexual taboos, incest and worse. In the musical, it comes off as something that could save our undead heroes, if they would let it. Throughout the whole musical, as far as I can recall, Claudia addresses both her adoptive parents only by their first names. Until, that is, the moment of her execution, when neither of them are there to hear her. Soon after that is the moment that made me want to make this video. After Claudia's death, Lestat finds Louis and...
I could not prevent it. I could not prevent it.
I know this line jumps out at me more than it would have because the TV show uses it as an episode title, but still... The use of this specific phrasing in and of itself emphasizes that Lestat could have prevented it. If there's any doubt on this point, it's dispensed with when Louis responds,
I could have stopped that. You never could have stopped Armand. I could have stopped her in New Orleans. I could have prevented all of this.
The ability to have stopped this tragedy from taking place is not just about the immediate moments leading up to it, but all of the decisions these characters made that brought them here. Armand could have prevented it easily, yes. Louis could have prevented it by talking her out of killing Lestat. Lestat could have prevented it by never making her what she was. The conversation ends with Louis reprising their duet from earlier, now with roles reversed. Armand returns to gloat. He and Lestat fight. Lestat is injured. He takes a moment to soliloquize his misery before Marius and Gabrielle show up to help him. Then comes the final line of the show, and I swear to you that you're not missing context here.
I'm the vampire Lestat, and I will live forever.
It feels unearned after the bleakness of the sequence preceding it. I'm not convinced at this point in the story that living forever is a good thing. And that would be fine if it didn't feel like that's how I meant to take this line. The end of the musical went through several iterations in the lead up to opening night before landing on the version I've just described. As performed in San Francisco, instead of giving Lestat his own blood to heal him, Marius has him drink from Akasha, the mother of all vampires, who in this version has been mentioned prior, though not in a way that necessarily makes this make sense. Marius explains that through the vampire queen's blood they are all connected, even those who have already passed on from this mortal coil, and this turns out to be a setup to have the whole cast come back on stage for the finale song. It's emotionally hollow. Even if Lestat has this metaphysical connection to the others, why would that automatically heal all rifts between them? They clearly realized this didn't work, but it feels like they never figured out what to replace it with. During previews, it was variously the case that Gabrielle showed up at the end to rescue Lestat, that Marius did, and finally that they both did together. But they never solved the core problem, which was that any happy reunions here feel out of place so immediately after Lestat watched his daughter die and his partner leave him. I harp on this not because the ending is that much worse than the rest of the musical, but because the problem with the ending is representative of the problems with this adaptation as a whole. It was always going to be hard to end this show because Interview with the Vampire and The Vampire Lestat are very different books with very different endings. They can't use the ending of Interview because that doesn't make sense if Lestat's the protagonist. But they can't use The Vampire Lestat's ending either because they've removed the frame narrative. And without the events taking place in the present day, the story doesn't so much end as fizzle out. But even if you're not going to adapt the specific events of either book, choosing what note to end the musical on begs the question, which one is this an adaptation of? Is vampirism a curse that weighs heavy on our hero's heart, as it is in Interview with the Vampire? Or is it something he can try to reclaim for his own ends, as it is in The Vampire Lestat? They never resolved this tension. The musical as it exists feels caught in between. I think, on some level, Lestat was dead on its feet before it ever had its first performance.